Jesse, very excited to
Hey.
have you to come and chat with us. Um, yeah, I mean, you're going to be too modest here, but I'm going to introduce you as the inventor of boot camps.
Okay, I'll take it.
Do you think you could walk us through the early days of Dev Bootcamp, how you got involved, and what that process was like? Because as I understand it, basically this hadn't been really done before, or maybe it had in some manifestation that you were aware of at the
Mhm.
time. I'm not sure.
And I'm assuming you had
But
you had a military background. Well, I didn't name it. Um, I had just left Everlane, which was a company I also co-founded. I was there for a little over 3 years, um, and I knew I wanted to do something in education. And how did that happen? I was talking with Heaton Shah, who was running Kissmetrics at the time. And he said, hey, there's this guy, Sharif Bechet. He's thinking about doing this in-person boot camp or whatever. He described that boot camp. And that format, that structure was on a short list of things I was interested in. So I talked with Sharif immediately and we hit it off. There was a third guy involved, Dave Hoover, who wound up running Chicago eventually. But, it started the very first cohort. It was filled, let me think. I can find it even. It was a post on Hacker News. So Sharif posted a note on Hacker News saying, come to San Francisco, we'll teach you how to code in, I forget what we promised then, 9 weeks, 10 weeks. And off to the races. It's the first thing really the only thing I've ever done that worked immediately in that way.
Hmm.
And there were a few programs we knew about that were somewhat similar, some of which we were close with the people involved. So um, I always forget their name. It was the biggest Groupon competitor at the
Oh,
time.
General Assembly, is that the
Living Social. Living Social, yeah,
Living Social?
there we
Yeah.
go, Living Social. And they had an internal boot camp called Hungry Academy, which was run by oh my god, I'm blanking on the name. He's the head of Turing Academy now.
We can ask Google later.
Yeah, I can't
The
remember
show
the
notes.
name.
Yeah.
I feel bad because we were in contact with him, and that was more about internal transfers. Like you're in marketing, we'll train you to be a software engineer, that sort of thing. So I would say that was the thing that was the most structurally similar in terms of the program. And there was another in-person program based out of Chicago, which I forget, it changed its name 2 or 3 times, but it was originally called Code Academy. And it was a lawsuit with codecademy.com, which that company got their trademark invalidated. So they had to change their name. But they eventually they pivoted to being more pure engineering, but originally the pitch was more, we're going to find people to non-technical people to give them enough technical skills and marketing skills and business skills to get an MVP off the ground.
What made you think that this model could work? Did you have experience with hiring people like this and training them up in previous roles?
I mean, I've always been one of the reasons I wanted to do education. Well, there were two reasons. The personal reason is I found in my first job after out of college out here in the Bay Area, when I was bored, I didn't even really know why or whatever, but I would put up tutoring services on Craigslist. So it's like, I'm bored. What should I do? I don't know. I'll go tutor people on the weekend. And then the second thing was the fact that inspired in some ways by the rise of MOOCs and things like Codecademy, a feeling of, like, at the time, remember this is like 2012, that's when we started this, late 2011. Everyone's talking about how MOOCs are going to replace universities and blah, blah, blah. And it was obvious to me that's not, the MOOC wasn't going to cut it. I mean, people don't go to MIT because they have the best textbooks. And so but what it proved to me or demonstrated to me is that maybe there was an opportunity to do something where you were actually, the students were the customers. Because before that, if you wanted to do something in air quotes education, you weren't really, the core competency was rarely pedagogical or educational. I mean, you were basically a sales company. Your job was to be good closing deals with districts and district administrators. And that's not something I'm good at, not something I want to get good at. So all of those things kind of pointed to maybe there's something more. And honestly, I mean, the launch of it was a bit of a lark. Just kind of like, I think we can do this. And
did you have a curriculum already? Or it was like, let's launch this and I'll figure it out as we
well,
go?
It was definitely more, we'll launch this and we'll figure it out. So the first cohort was really rough curriculum-wise. We cobbled things together. We used the Hungry Academy people had some open source stuff we used. And Jeff, I think his name was Jeff. And he was an advisor. So it's not like we took his stuff and we're using it without his knowledge. He was helping us make good use of it. And then between the first and second, so that first year, the structure was basically 10 weeks on, 10 weeks off, 10 weeks on, 10 weeks off. Like we alternated like that. So big block classes. And between the first and second cohort, I decided Sharif didn't really want this, but I just did it. We made our own curriculum. So from that point forward, it was all our own writing. And I guess for the people listening, that was mostly my role. Was, I would say, I mean, I think my formal title was Chief Academic Officer, but designing the overall learning experience and managing the small team that was building the internal learning management system.
So I'm very interested in this just because it kind of set the stage for I wouldn't say derivative boot camps necessarily, but there's an inspiration from the model that let's just say the DBC legacy lives on in different ways. What did you feel was your kind of design space? What were the major design decisions that you felt you had to make, you did make in that process?
Of building a program?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a real pressure in that environment to teach to the test, so to speak. And everyone assumes that's what you're doing. Like you're just cramming people to ace an interview and then you wash your hands of the student. And I certainly, while I was there, acted as a bulwark against any pressure to do that to the best of my ability. And I mean, so that was always a constraint, like we were never going to violate. We knew we wanted, and it was a lot easier then. It wasn't easy, but it was easier then to hire staff who had real experience. So the technical experience of our teaching staff was pretty substantial. It was people who were like former senior software engineers and VPs of engineering and things like that, people who had really run teams. And to get what we needed to get out of it, I mean, really there was this incredible sensitivity to the opportunity cost of every little moment of the experience. So sometimes the way I phrase it is, it's not enough to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You have to kill 10 birds with 1 stone, like every chance you get. So we knew we had to make conscious use of the fact that students are here together. There's a social environment. Like we're leaving leverage on the table if we aren't facilitating interactions between students in a productive way. Not just like, okay, we're all about pair programming. Here's a lecture on pair programming. From now on, you're pair programming, and then not really talking about it again. And also making as much use of the built environment as we could, I would say. And trying
what's the built environment mean?
Like the physical space.
Okay.
Like we were pretty intentional about the arrangement of the materials and how students came and went during the day and what opportunities that afforded. And, okay, we have to make sure if we're having a sidebar conversation, it happens here. And eventually we switched to a rolling cohort model, which some other programs started, where it was like it was a 9-week core, 9 or 12-week core, and it was divided into 3-week chunks that we called phases. And in every 3 weeks, a new batch of about 20 students would come in.
It's like row your boat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are pros and cons to that, but it meant, there was a sense of tides coming in and tides coming out into the space. And like, for example, I guess just like a specific example, the very first thing students experienced was 9 a.m. on the Monday when the cohort started. The doors are locked. They're all gathering up outside. They're all nervous. They're like, what are we here? What are we doing? Are we in the right place? I don't know. I knocked. Someone stuck their head out and told us to wait. We don't open until 9. I'm not sure, blah, blah, blah. And the staff sort of lines up, and the students, once we did rolling cohorts, because there were students there, a kind of single file, 2 lines, a sort of human hallway. The doors open and everyone's like applauding the students as they walk in single file. And so it was very much, okay, what's happening in the first 30 seconds that is going to simultaneously confound any like maladaptive expectations they have about the experience. Oh, I wonder if I have a desk. I wonder if I have an assigned seat. I wonder if this is going to be like my college class. I wonder if, and also kind of drive home the energy of the space. So we carried that.
I was just going to say, I love that because it reminds me of that, like going to university, there's this sense that people have been here before. This is a place of like respect for knowledge, respect for each other, respect for your fellow students and your teachers. So having some sort of ceremonies like that, it always put me in the space of, okay, let's get this thing going. This is a place I'm meant to be. So it's really cool that you thought to do that.
Yeah, I mean, every day, right? We would always bookend the day. There were like starting rituals and ending rituals, and it helps set the container of the experience, and it makes it easier for us to say. I mean, we tell students, we do our best to scare them off if this is something that would scare them off, but say, you need to think of this as like a meditation retreat in Bhutan or something. I mean, that's really how you need to be thinking about it. Tell your friends, tell your family, you're not going to have time to chit chat realistically, especially during the day. And having those rituals where you enter and leave helps set that stage and force that boundary.
Can I rewind for a second? Just something that's on my mind is that this era, this 2012 era, I just recall that like with the MOOC spirit, it really felt like education and ed tech were this, that was like the crypto of that time. Like people are talking about it. It felt like things were changing. And I remember as an aspiring software engineer, or thinking that maybe I could be, was doing some of these MOOCs and not doing very well. I remember I made a decent amount of progress with Steve Huffman's something or other, or he was teaching.
Oh yeah. He was
engine. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause he was a mentor at Dev Bootcamp.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I remember him telling stories about having to go to Stanford and they're filming him, and it was Coursera, I think, early Coursera.
Totally. Yeah. And they kept cropping up, and then they're like Khan Academy rolling out. It just, that was a good era. I liked that era, and I want that era to return.
There's a lot going for it. I think you're right that this is part of what inspired. There was a reactive element to starting Dev Bootcamp where it was like, okay, MOOCs aren't it. Like, I'm sorry, pre-recorded lectures aren't it. I think what it felt like, and I don't know that we've actually advanced past it, is early movies were stage plays put to film, and the medium wasn't really explored yet. And so, at least if we're talking about MOOCs and we're talking about online learning, there's the whole design space that like the conversation barely gets beyond online learning. It'll be about personalization and asynchronous this and accessibility, and that's about where the conversation ends. And then what is it? Well, it's, you get to watch a lecture, and then you get a quiz.
So like up to this point, even now, is the physical presence, do you consider that to be continuing to be a key part of the pedagogy for learning this?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I always thought of all these things as just another constraint. So like, I've taught online. I mean, I've spent most of the last 5 years teaching online, and there are elements of it. I would say on the whole, it is harder to get access to certain like highly leveraged activities and create the kind of cohesive overall experience when you're doing things remotely. But it's not impossible. And I see it as just a kind of just another constraint, fine. There's a bunch of resources we would have available to ourselves if we were doing it in person that we don't necessarily have available when we're doing it online. And there are some resources we have available because we're doing it online that we wouldn't otherwise have if we were doing it in person. That said, I do think on balance, that transition, you give up more than you get generally. And I think people who don't feel that, try to say it nicely, I guess, I think they just don't know what to do with, like, they don't see the fact that you have 20 students in the same room at the same time, focusing on roughly the same things, as an opportunity to do really powerful leverage stuff. And if they, like most classes I was in college, didn't take advantage of that fact at all. It was pretty much like, it could have been just me in that lecture hall, or it could have been me with 50 other people in that lecture hall, and it wouldn't have made a substantial difference in terms of how the experience played out. So if that's your idea of what a learning experience should be like, then of course doing something online seems like only upside and no downside. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of tiny things. Even, I'm a tall guy, and I have a kind of flat affect, and a lot of my getting a room of students to loosen up and laugh has to do with my physicality, and that's very difficult to do online.
Yeah. So if you stood up right now, you would not be scary. Is that what you're saying?
It's, people just can't tell. I mean, even when I meet a student I've only taught online, they're like, holy crap, I'm not that tall. I'm like 6'2". Okay. But, a 6'2" guy with a voice projecting, like, look, okay. So for the last few years, I've been teaching college students, and in that structure, part of what we had them doing every Friday was giving some kind of demo or presentation, some public speaking activity. And there's a big difference between me standing up in front of the room and showing them what projecting means. Like, full chest, you in the back, Rachel, shouting something that's maybe a little bit nonsense, but intentionally being unself-conscious about it. You can't really do that online in the same way.
Yeah. And
you shouldn't, because you'll blow the speakers out unless you have your stuff set up correctly.
If I could tell a brief aside on this,
yeah.
That's an embarrassing personal story. I did mock trial in high school, where you sort of get this case and it's a competition and whatnot. And we eventually compete against other schools. And my nervous tick is to get really loud. And when I get nervous, I get louder. And so in high school, we were in a real courtroom. And so my teacher advisor said, stand in the back of the well and then just do what you do, get nervous. And people think, this person is extremely confident. They're really good. I did it in college. And instead of in a courtroom, it was in a tiny little classroom. And our team was just getting destroyed. And afterwards, we just gotten, like, at the end, the judges, who are these probably like hungover local lawyers, will rate you, and our team got killed. But he called me up to the bench and said, look, and I'm walking up expecting this person to say, look, you're a rare talent. You're surrounded by a bunch of losers. And he's like, look, I needed to ask, like, do you have do you have a problem controlling your voice? Like, is there
Oh,
like
no.
something? And I didn't have the presence to mind to be like, what? But it was terrible. So, yeah, I see I'm talking loud now. It's just, this is my failure mode.
Well, yeah, it doesn't, I guess, yeah, that's a funny story. And it's just, I guess, to me, an example of a whole dimension of activity that you can't translate in a straightforward way to doing something online. I mean, maybe there's some analogous way of doing it online, but like there's something to having a person who has never raised their voice above whatever 5 decibels. I actually don't really know what quiet is on decibel scale, but someone who's a quiet person, coaxing them to say something really loud enough that everyone in the back can even hear them, and watching them do that for the first time. I mean, if you're doing it online, people would be annoyed probably. Like, why are you shouting in the next room? Please stop. Right.
What I really miss about teaching in person, I mean, you guys know I've been teaching online maybe almost 3 years now. And the in-person experience that I love most is when students are working actively on something and overhearing one another just a little bit. Like they're focused on their thing, but also other students are working on things. I'm walking around asking questions. They're asking me questions, and there's this like ambient kind of leaking of experience from one group to another that has effects that you just can't simulate on Zoom. Like when I was trying Zoom rooms, I was like, this is okay, but I want the audio to leak. Like I don't want it to be such an isolated thing where you move from one room to another, you know. There are things like that that are hard to articulate or hard to even realize how much value there is in it until you've lost it. So that kind of thing would be great to try and recreate. Again, just to move the constraints a little bit in one direction.
I love that too. Even when I was at Hack Reactor, bubbling around and like, okay, I'm working on this group project, but then I hear someone like, oh, people are shouting over here, and we all kind of crowd around the machine, and someone's figured out something awesome, and then we come back and try that.
Yeah.
And that was a huge part of it for me.
Yeah, like you can't stand up in the middle of the room and go, hey, everybody, Charlie's figured something out. Everyone go over to his computer right now. You know, maybe you're being, whatever, I don't know what you're like, but I might do this to a student who did something great and is being a little sheepish about it.
Yeah.
And then I, in my big voice, get everyone in the space to come over and crowd around this person right away. I mean, I don't know that, like that pays dividends, not just in terms of the mechanics of like spreading that information around, but in terms of that person's self-identity as a learner and their own sense of like their capabilities.
I remember in 3rd grade, we had this teacher. It was very common where they, for whatever reason, I don't know how this was a learning activity, but there'd be a chapter we'd have to read out of our book, and each kid would read 1 sentence or 1 paragraph. And I think our teacher one day said to me, Charlie, you know what? You're doing a good job. You read the rest of the chapter. This was the greatest honor I had ever received from this point forward. I loved reading. I knew I was a good reader. And those little moments do make a huge difference.
Yeah. It's honestly, having done remote work and in-person work, it's analogous in the sense that all of these implicit things you have to go out of your way to make explicit, and you can't make everything explicit. Like a list of the 832 implicit things we do is actually not a useful list at all. It's just confusing. And it still doesn't fully capture it. And it's the same problem. I mean, I think there are ways around it, but the high level thing, the way I've always thought about it is what gets erased when you go online is like the periphery. All the periphery goes away. I can't see someone fidgeting out of the corner of my eye anymore. I can't ask for a spot check and, just at a glance, see how many people have raised their hand anymore. I can't, all of that is erased. And none of the software, like imagine if Zoom, when they had the hand raising feature, it made a little like plunk audio sound or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you were just like, okay, raise your hand if blah, blah, blah. And you would just be able to tell by the volume of the little pitter patter response instead of having to like, what do? You can't even use the hand raising feature for that. It's like this weird skeuomorphic thing, but it's actually inappropriate because I can't even take a poll of the room with a hand raising feature. So it's like every piece of software is a bit like that across the board.
Have you seen Recurse Sender, I think had built something like this where for their programs, their cohorts, they had some sort of 2D dungeon crawler style map.
Yeah.
Where
I've seen a few of those things. It's cool that they built their own.
Yeah.
There's something to that. And I remember right when COVID hit, there were some of these fun spatial audio style meeting things. I forget. There was one I really liked where you could like drag your own avatar around. And there's like a Doppler effect type of thing, is that you get closer to someone else. And so you could be like, and then just drag your own avatar like past theirs, and they would hear you as if you were running by. And, okay, that's like an interaction that who knows what fruit it'll bear, but it's like interesting at least.
So Jesse, I know you're very thoughtful about a lot of pieces of the experience, but I think I'm most interested in the curriculum decisions that you made.
Oh, sure.
I mean, maybe you just don't think that they're as important as some of the other like cultural and physical aspects of the program. But I'm curious, like, how did you decide upon the scope of the program? Like, obviously, you needed to cut a lot out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a typical, I don't know, standard, whatever, with backwards design. I mean, we started with imagining what the ideal junior software engineer was like, or like low, junior plus, first non-junior role. What is that ideal person like? And then how do we do everything in our power to give them the right combination of knowledge, skills, and attitudes and habits? So
what is the ideal junior engineer like?
Well, I
feel like the debate's out. And also, like, even if there were a decision, everyone's going to approach that objective differently. And then they'll like manifest the kind of the outcomes,
yes,
if I can use that word, of the existing boot camps are highly variable,
of course,
even if they purport to aim for the same thing. So what was that to you, or what is that to you now?
I think ultimately it's an ability to, I mean, what's going to happen with a junior engineer at most companies? Most companies don't have, and this maybe has changed over time, I don't think it really has. Like, for example, they don't really have a structured onboarding process. And so there's an expectation that they will simultaneously be orienting themselves in a very unfamiliar situation while being proactive in terms of looking for problems to solve, and also proactive in terms of asking questions that need to be asked, and not doing things like being stuck, deciding I'm going to work on this ticket, spending a week and a half on it to no avail without ever kind of getting feedback before before that. So I think it's, we want people who are ready to, I would guess, just like raise their hand and say, I'm up for it.
Was there any challenge in designing curriculum for that or thinking through that? Because I feel like half the students in the boot camp might be doing a career switch versus some might be like fresh out of college. So you have some folks who have been in the quote unquote corporate environment in some way,
right,
maybe have learned that, but then others, I know in my case, there were a bunch of people who had just completed college and just thrown themselves into this. And they were, very different from me. I was 6 years or 7 years into working at 2 or 3 different companies at that point.
Yeah, well, over time, those first few cohorts, it really was like the Wild West. I mean, who says yes to a totally unproven program, move across the country?
Omar.
Omar.
Yeah.
Omar was on the tail end of what I would call the Wild West period. He was in the first or second cohort where things were really like the hatches had been battened down a bit. The first 2 or 3 cohorts were, it felt like every day we were just trying to keep the ball in the court a little bit, for better or worse. And the median age lowered over time. So the median age that first year was it was like in the low 30s. So it was almost all people looking to switch careers. There were some exceptions, but the exceptions tended to be some kind of extreme outlier. Like, I'm a 17-year-old who doesn't even want to go to college and I don't care. I just want to learn how to program. Or I want to learn how to code to launch my own startup. And I mean, we actually had a student who did this. You know Alyssa, right? Do you know Alyssa?
I do, actually, yeah.
Yeah, because I know Miles helped her out a bunch too. But
her company is doing great now, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, HipCamp.
Oh, sweet.
And yeah, she was working. That was her final project at Dev Bootcamp.
Damn.
And I forget what cohort she was in. I think the second one, actually. And she just showed up and was like, we were like, wait, it took us a while. But we were like, wait, who are you? Why are you here? And we didn't just let her in. I forget what we did. But I think we told her, no, we can't just let you. Actually, I'd have to ask her to remember. I forget if we let her attend that cohort or we asked her to come back and
write the reduce function or something in JavaScript.
No, but or come back for the next cohort. I think she might have done that one, but it was a bit like, okay, just understand this is an exceptional situation, and you have to be prepared for us to pull the plug on you if this winds up being not the right call. But it was the right call.
Jesse, a recurring theme of this conversations we've had is the just show up model.
Yeah,
it tends to have some extremely good outcomes.
It does. It was kind of nuts though. I mean, she just walked in with the line of students and we were like, hey, everybody. And we just, who are you? What are you doing here? And I forget if she'd interviewed or not, but that sort of student became less and less common over time. They became people who were either graduated college, but if I decided I didn't like my major my sophomore year instead of my senior year, I might have switched majors, but I couldn't, that sort of thing. So, we try to draw on people's prior professional experience. I mean, to your point, it's much easier to have that kind of conversation about, like, if you've seen that junior-senior relationship play out in your prior role or in adjacent roles, it's much easier to just be like, hey, you've seen how that can go well. You've seen how that can go poorly. Here's what that looks like for an engineer. And it takes less convincing them that, let's call it, that social dimension is important. Whereas the people right out of college, I mean, their idea of teamwork is a group assignment at a computer science lab or something. It's a bit of a joke.
Yeah, both of you have designed curriculums. I have not, but one thing I'm imagining is, as you're sort of building the ship as it's going, you might recognize cohort to cohort that, like, oh man, we should probably teach people about databases. So you like slide that in at this section of the course, and then you do that next cohort, and it's like, okay, that was a little bit too early for databases. Let me move the index card over. How did you model the sequencing for walking people through that? Because it feels like practically you have to come up with some linear path in some way, because it's like, the x-axis is time. But did you allow for forking? Maybe
do you?
Maybe you don't. I don't know.
The process was, well, the metaphor was always, not always. What we settled on was, you yes, there is a kind of main road, and the progression of, let's call it, topics is somewhat linear. But like on any given day, there was about twice as much as any student could realistically do of work we put in front of them. This is actually hard for the students who came right out of college, who are very much used to, like, if this is the work, we're expected to do all of it. And some of them would really, especially the superstar A students, would really wrap themselves around the axle, being like, I only got 40% of it done. How on earth am I supposed to get it all done? It's like, you're not supposed to get it all done.
Yeah, I still haven't done N Queens yet. That's
right.
Outstanding for me.
So that was, I mean, that's one element. And then what are the big changes we made? So one is, I guess, try to focus on the things that won't change. That'll be like, if there's something that will be relevant, no matter what context they go on to interview at or what job they get, and we can make hay out of it, then that's the kind of thing we're going to make hay out of. So we tended to avoid a lot of, people are surprised by this sometimes. Yes, it's a Rails boot camp. In the 9-week core, students didn't get introduced to Rails until week 7. Like, they didn't touch Rails. I mean, look, they can do it on their own, I guess. And they probably did some of it before they went through a Rails tutorial or something. But they didn't touch Rails until the last third of the program. And it was much more about, how can we make it so that Rails feels like a breath of, like an oasis in a desert.
I sometimes feel this way about, like, oh, should I learn Rust or should I learn C first so that I appreciate Rust?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's sort of like, sometimes all you have to do with a student is give them a brief outline of the sort of problem that this thing would solve, and you can tell it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't necessarily need a lot of justifying. Other times, early on we had Rails earlier, because this is one of these things, and it's like the students are drowning in navigating like the form helpers to generate forms. But that's because they don't have a sense of what their target is. Like, they don't have a picture in their head of what you want the form to even look like. They don't even have a concept of, these are just functions that are returning a string that contains HTML. And so they learned SQL before they did an ORM. They wrote procedural code before they did object-oriented code. They started with command line programs, and then they did networked programs, and then they did web-based stuff. And in a lot of ways, it just like recapitulated history. That's one way I would explain it sometimes, is we just have the students reenact the history of programming, but at 1,000% speed and minus certain detours. An example of a decision we had to make that I was not sure about was, like, Rails at the time, and I would say the broader web development ecosystem was getting really excited about CoffeeScript. Everyone loved CoffeeScript, and probably a quarter of the students were like, CoffeeScript. And I was just like, no CoffeeScript. Absolutely no CoffeeScript. I'm like, if you want to use it, you can use it, I guess, but understand what you're doing is you're taking on project risk by trying to do something in a day using a technology you've never touched before.
Yeah.
So there are a handful of decisions like that, but it's a bit like, look, if they know SQL well enough, ideally really well, then, and they have a high level concept of what ORMs do, and they have enough contact with at least one representative ORM, they'll be able to look at like SQL alchemy code and understand what's going on, even if they don't understand Python. It's not going to be a mystery to them if we've done our job.
I have so much that I want to talk to you about, Jesse, in relation to this, because I wonder, Well, let me firstly say, like, I take the same approach of the historical reenactment, and I also feel like we absolutely should not start with a foregone conclusion of this. We should motivate some of the more powerful or high level abstractions that they will end up using. But I feel like I'm in a privileged position of working with folk who have had exposure more
Right.
to the high level abstraction than the low level abstraction, and are in a place in their careers where they are excited to, they have the appetite to peel back the layers. I mean, one of the courses that we teach, we just call software systems behind the abstractions. It's just like, you've been using this in front of the abstraction, now look behind the abstraction. And it's like, here's Wireshark, here's strace, here's even thinking about the kernel, like behind the system call, here's even what a system call is. And we're doing this with people who are already motivated to do that, I feel like, because they have enough, almost too much orientation.
Mhm.
It's like the other day, Elliot taught a class where I kid you not, this is one of the most popular classes that either of us teaches based on student ratings, and it involves hand traversal of a Postgres B plus tree in hexdump.
All right.
Yeah, so it's like so it's like we're spoken about indexes in theory. You all know the best practices of whatever. Slap an index on it if it's slow.
Done.
Now let's
Yeah.
literally like look at the index file byte by byte in hexdump. But we can do that because they have had 5 years of experience of being frustrated with just slapping an index on it when it seems slow. There is an appetite for understanding how it actually works, and so we can almost overcompensate. Like, how many people in the world can hand traverse a B tree in hexdump? Like, it's not a skill that we want them to develop. It's just like exposing them to
Right,
the
right.
ability to go that far if they want. So all this is to say, I've always felt like we're selecting for people who are excited to do this at a time in their careers where they're excited to do this, and that's a function of them already seeing the high level stuff. So I wonder for you, like, was there an aspect of selecting students for the cohort? Was it like uh, fostering the motivation that they came in with? Is it the short period of time? Like, I guess I'm trying to say, how do you get away with starting from the lower level thing and only introducing Rails in 7 weeks? Or another way of putting it, like, a lot of people struggle with mathematics because it's kind of like 12 years of building up to calculus,
Sure.
you know?
Right.
It's like, if you just gave them a taste of the calculus that they could do, maybe that would motivate more people along the way.
Well, that's really it, I think, which is, I mean, abstractions are powerful because they have like their powers in their generality, which means their powers in a number of situations where they have a role to play, which means if it's actually a powerful abstraction, as you go through the normal course of business, there should be no shortage of opportunities for you to be able to point at the thing if you constrain the problems in the right way. Using to talk about Btrees, for example, a standard way that kind of thing comes up before they even get to SQL is we have them build a to-do app on the command line, and we emphasize separation of concerns and the law of Demeter, and just it's as much about those principles per se as it is about having them organize their own thoughts as they approach the problem. But invariably the way they do it is they like read the text file into memory, manipulate it to memory, and write it all out. And it's like, great. Some students, they sort of get to the end of that just in the nick of time. Or the feedback is more about the heart of that material, which is about the object-oriented stuff and getting more exposure to the command line and so on and so forth. But other students, it's not a big deal. And you say, okay, well, this is how your program's working here. Here's an example to-do list that has 13 million items in it. Your program's awful slow now. Let's talk about, well, give me some ideas for how you can make this faster. If you want to print it out and sort it this way or sort it that way. And it doesn't take much probing for them to come up something that is within striking distance of a B plus tree. At which point you can say, by the way, This is something called a B plus tree, yada, yada. If they're into it at that moment in time, by all means, elaborate on it. But I think there are lots of opportunities to draw students into those higher level concepts sooner rather than later. I think the problem is when the process of learning is conceptualized as like, okay, well, if we're going to cover B plus trees, then there has to be a B plus tree unit that starts at a defined point in time, that every student has to have a certain level of prior knowledge for them to even to be able to understand the lecture. But also, if it's a lecture, that means probably we're going to be, I mean, it's so many layers removed from like actual code. It's going to be like diagrams and stuff. And you have to think about, maybe pseudocode if you're lucky, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that's, pulling that off in a way that where it lands and so on and so forth that's hard. It's hard to do. And I think you don't do that. You try to design the material so that when you see there's an opportunity for a student, like this student is the kind of student who would be well served by pointing out this connection here and now, because this connection is here and now. And maybe that connection, they'd already passed 10 other instances of it, and the instructor just decided it wasn't worth pointing out for whatever reason. Like the student was stressed. They felt like they were behind in time. They're panicking. A student in that frame of mind, it probably isn't good to go, okay, great, you got the to-do app done. Let's talk about B plus trees. No, you'll send them into a tailspin if you do that.
So did you practically do that? Did you have your instructors sort of keeping these notes on people as they went along to
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the curriculum was designed, I mean, the beats were mostly around, like everything was designed to get students to generate feedback-worthy code. And without falling into the trap of having like some prescribed solution in mind. Like we want the student to actually be able to make an earnest attempt using their own judgment, not just fill in the blanks or do what they think we want them to do, but not have it be so all over the place that it becomes impossible. Like realistically, you can't, if you have 50 students and each student has their own unique little approach to the problem, you're not going to be able to give 50 unique pieces of feedback. But more than that, you lose leverage, because now the students, it's harder for them when they're talking to each other to even reconcile their different approaches, right? So it's this balance between, there's like some variability that isn't good, and there's other variability that is, I think, at the heart of what drives the learning experience. And we could clock things like by the fourth day of the second, or by the Wednesday of the second week, probably 80% of the students are going to be writing functions or methods that have 3 or more, 4, 5, 6 positional arguments. And yeah, so then there can be little tactical things to drive the point home about why this isn't a great idea. You walk over to a pair. Who wrote this? Oh, Charlie wrote this. Turn off the monitor. Oz, what's the fifth argument to this function? And Oz is like, I don't. And you say, okay, that's the point. All right. And then in the afternoon, you do a lecture on named arguments, and it makes sense. You know that everyone's ready for it. But also we design it so that roughly it's like that Wednesday plus or minus a day, we know all the students are going to be ready for that talk, because the material's been designed to push them towards, making the honest kind of mistake someone would make if they understood the assignment but didn't know what named arguments were and only understood positional arguments.
Did you have any, that feels Socratic to me, in so far as you have the wise teacher walking around and probing and asking questions? Is that such a natural way of teaching that, or was that something that you're like, oh, we want our teachers to be actively doing this? How pedagogically like direct were you in thinking about this stuff?
Oh, you have to know. I mean, it really depends on the student. Like,
yeah.
If you can I'll use Omar as an example since he was on the podcast previously. He was the kind of student where I learned very quickly I can make a high level, almost like meta point, and he'll understand it more or less as I intend it to be understood. And like, I'm not looking to, and I wouldn't encourage any instructor to be Socratic for the sake of being Socratic. Like if you can give a straightforward piece of feedback, and be confident that the student will understand the lesson as you intend it, as opposed to like, oh, well, I better not name my variables like this or I'll get points knocked off or something like that. Then of course it's just a waste of time to play some Socratic game. And I tend to fall, you also have to allow for variability among the staff and their personalities and their temperaments. Like, especially if you're hiring people who, for the most part, are professional software engineers, you can't ask them to all teach in the same way. That'll drive them nuts. They're experienced people who have years of professional judgment, and it'd be like asking a team of engineers to all write code the same way. They'd go bonkers. So, you need to allow room for that. There were teachers who basically refused to give a lecture. Okay, maybe that's too much. There were teachers who were afraid to be one-on-one or one-on-two with the student because they get really anxious about the possibility that a student might ask them a question that they don't know the answer to. You have to find a way to make all of that work. And the easiest way, I think, this is again why it's easier to do this in person. If everyone's kind of bouncing around and you're never going too long without seeing what's going on, then it's hard for things to get too out of control. Like a student basically has to go hide somewhere for you not to see them. Like we're all in the same space.
I have a question that's also going to be advice for me. I can ask you the question, but maybe I should also set up a little bit. The question is, does this kind of approach, philosophy, lead to insufficient structure for a lot of students? At least the perception of structure?
Yes, I would, the latter I would say. I mean, I did it this way with my college students too, and it was funny. They basically had the college students demand a level of explicit structure that was, they like overwhelmed me, their demands. And I had a group that pretty much mutinied. They were like, they really wanted a layout of like what was happening on any given day for the entire program, beat by beat. Never mind the fact that some days we're calling an audible or something serendipitous might happen. And also my feeling of what is knowing what is coming on like 4 weeks from now, how is that going to help you at anything this week? Nothing. You're not going to use that information to do anything except ask me a question about why we're learning this thing in 4 weeks. And it's honestly a distraction. But they mutinied, and I showed them the spreadsheet of like kind of the score, so to speak, of how things are going to be introduced and when and where the points of variation are. And one of the students went, "Oh my God, you mean this entire time my life has been being run by a spreadsheet?" I was like, yes. So we tried to create this picture of it feeling a bit uncontrolled or serendipitous, but it's less. There's more structure than I think meets the eye for the students. There's always
a spreadsheet.
There's always a spreadsheet, yeah. and they do feel this is a double-edged sword. It's like as I'm sure you've experienced this, there's something you want students to learn, and you give a talk about it, and then you have them go off and try and implement it. And you can tell that you just spent an hour or whatever saying a bunch of stuff, illustrating a bunch of stuff that they're not really connecting the dots. That they aren't recognizing the things they're supposed to recognize. They're not implementing the strategies you maybe ask them to implement. And you wind up having to give them a bunch of feedback that more or less just echoes the stuff you had talked about beforehand. But if you flip it, where you kind of have the students go out and take a stab at it and then like come back and then give a talk and then maybe have them go out again and try something, round two, they very often will feel like and this is more of a cultural thing, but a non-trivial percentage of students will feel like you set them up for failure, that you're messing with them. You're asking me to do stuff, but you haven't given me a talk about how to install a Ruby gem, but you're asking me to install a Ruby gem. Why haven't you introduced that yet before it's in an exercise? I don't know. Have you had that experience, Oz?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. Yeah. I mean, it's gotten to the point where for CS Prima, I'm basically just trying to select for people who have at least some appetite for the struggle. And I'm just trying to make it very clear that I feel like this is my presentation of how one ought to learn this stuff, that you should be programming to learn computer science. And sometimes it's going to feel a little harder than you're used to, and sometimes a little easier. And there's just going to be this like gradual struggle towards success, and that this is ideal. But if you feel like I'm setting you up for failure here, there are other places where you can go and just watch the lecture.
Right.
And I've tried to make a compromise by, for instance, actually having work solutions where other problem sets, if you think of it as a problem set and work solutions, others omit the work solutions. And I might also say, here are some hints, here is a base goal and stretch goals. And so I'm not saying like it is just you ought to struggle as much as possible. But there's one thing that I feel like I can't work with, and that is coming in with the mindset that any struggle is a sign of failure, or a step towards failure of the instructor or of the individual. I feel like I do not have the tools to work with that, and I do see that all the time. And at the moment, I'm just trying to make it clear what I'm offering. Yeah, I'd like to have a better answer for that. I think I've spoken to you about this a couple of times before, in different forms. But
we spent a lot of time. I mean, I have every place I've taught in the last decade now. Geez, kind of actively recoding students' relationship with struggle and confusion.
I think the Edward Nygma in the background is making me think of the why do we fall, Master Wayne line from Batman Begins to pick ourselves back up. Yeah. Someone to remind us that.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, because not all struggle is productive struggle. And it's like part of the teacher's job is to get students struggling in a productive way, and then you demonstrate to them the fact that it paid dividends that you didn't anticipate for it to pay enough. They start to get the message. At the very least, they step back from this attitude of like, well, it should never feel like this. And I will say, actually, that often happens with people who have more professional experience, because they come in, someone who's really good at something else, they step into learn something new intensely from start to finish, if they've never done something like that before from scratch, it's a bit like they haven't been in that position for 10, 15, 20 years maybe, and they're not used to feeling like they don't know what they're doing, and it's hard for them to orient themselves, and it just feels like wrong. Like, I shouldn't feel like this needs to stop now, as opposed to seeing it as
this is what I'm here to do.
Yeah. Or it's a signal. It's a signal that's telling you something, and it's actually many signals layered on top of each other if you lean into it a bit. And part of our job is to structure the experience so that most of the time the struggle is productive versus not.
Speaking of signals, I'm getting many signals. I need to exit the call right now. Jesse, it was amazing meeting you. I feel like we should continue this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, let's go. Okay, bye-bye.